Close your eyes and imagine a kitchen with no refrigerator, no running water, no stove with controlled flame, no measuring cups, no cookbook, no thermometer, no timer, no supermarket 15 minutes away, no plastic wrap, no cans, no freezer humming in the corner. Just fire, stone, whatever grew nearby or could be kept alive through winter. This was the medieval kitchen, not a room most of the time, not even a separate space. For most ordinary people living in Europe between roughly 500 and 1500 AD, the kitchen was simply wherever the fire was. A hearth in the center of a one-room house, smoke drifting up through a hole in the thatch above. A pot hanging from an iron hook, the same pot used for everything, washed infrequently, shared by the whole family, and sometimes by the livestock, who shared the building through the coldest months, their body heat necessary for survival in a world without insulation or heating beyond the fire itself. Tonight, we are going to spend time in that kitchen. We are going to sit beside that fire and look slowly and carefully at what was in the pot, at what was on the table, or rather the rough wooden plank that served as a table, at what people put in their mouths every single day for 10 centuries without the ability to order something different if what was available didn't suit them, without the comfort of knowing that if this harvest failed, there was a global supply chain that would fill the gap. This is not a comfortable history. Medieval food was, by almost every modern standard, inadequate. It was often dangerous in ways that its consumers could not detect or prevent. It was frequently the direct cause of disease and early death, and yet it fed the medieval world. It sustained a civilization, complex, creative, deeply human, across 1,000 years of scarcity and plenty, plague and harvest, faith and doubt. There is also something else in this story, something slower and more human than the health statistics. The medieval relationship with food was, in its way, more intimate than ours, more physical, more seasonal, more directly connected to the specific land and specific weather of a specific place. People knew exactly where their food came from because they had been there. They knew exactly how much they had because they had counted it. They understood scarcity with a directness that most people in the modern world have never been required to understand. And in that scarcity, there was knowledge. In the limitation, there was a relationship with food that we have mostly, in our abundance, entirely lost. Settle in. Let the fire warm you. We are going back. Back to the stone and the smoke and the hearth and the pot. Back to the medieval kitchen before the kitchen existed.
What bread really was, bread. It seems like a simple thing. We pass it without much thought, a dinner roll, a slice of sandwich bread, a sourdough loaf from the bakery down the street. We eat it casually, or we avoid it deliberately, because we have been told that carbohydrates are something to be managed. We rarely think about bread as extraordinary. It is simply there, but in medieval Europe, bread was not a side dish. Bread was the meal. Bread was survival. For the vast majority of the population for most of the medieval period, bread accounted for between 60 and 80% of everything a person ate, every day, through their entire life. Not an exaggeration. Not rhetoric. If you were an ordinary person, a peasant farmer, a village craftsman, a household servant, a beggar at a monastery gate, bread was the center around which everything else organized. To not have bread was to be in a state of emergency. Let us understand what this bread actually was, because it bears almost no resemblance to what the word conjures today. Medieval bread for most people was dense and dark and heavy, a thick thing, coarse with the bran that expensive milling would have removed, made from barley or rye or a mixture of whatever grains were available. Oats, millet, legumes ground into the flour to stretch it further, all of these appeared in the bread of ordinary people at various times and places. Wheat, the grain we now associate with bread as its default, was largely a luxury for most of the medieval period. The whiteness of wheat bread was a statement about wealth. Dark bread meant ordinary life. The texture of this bread was nothing like modern bread. It was dense enough to be used as a plate, and was, in the form of the trencher. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread, several days old, cut flat and used as a surface on which other food was placed and from which it was eaten. The juices from the meat or the pottage soaked into the trencher during the meal. At the end, the trencher was eaten, or given to the dog, or distributed to the poor who waited at the gate. Function and charity in the same piece of bread. This is how the medieval world thought about things: nothing wasted, every object doing multiple jobs, because that was the only sensible way. The bread was leavened in most cases, though not with commercial yeast of the kind we use today. A piece of the previous batch of dough, the starter, was kept and used to make the next batch rise. This culture lived in the household sometimes for generations, passed from mother to daughter, carried when a family moved, cared for as a living thing, because it was a living thing. A household that lost its starter had lost something genuinely important, not as important as a cow or an ox, but more immediately consequential than many other tools, because the bread you ate in 3 days depended on the organism you maintained today. Medieval ovens deserve attention of their own. Most ordinary households did not have a proper baking oven. Maintaining the clay or stone structure hot enough for bread required fuel and time that peasant families rarely had in the quantities needed. Instead, bread was baked in communal ovens, which were owned by the lord of the manor or the church or the town, and which peasants paid to use. You brought your shaped loaves, paid your fee in grain or coin or labor, and waited while the baker managed the fire. The communal oven was also a communal space, a place where people gathered, where information moved through the village, where the social life of the community happened in the background of the practical necessity of baking, and then there was the problem of the grain itself. Bread was only as good as the grain it started from, and medieval grain was frequently compromised in ways that ranged from inconvenient to genuinely lethal. Grain stored through winter, the only option before refrigeration, was vulnerable to moisture, to vermin, to the fungi that could colonize damp grain and transform it into something very different from food. The most significant of these fungi was Claviceps purpurea, the organism responsible for ergot, which grows on rye and produces alkaloid compounds that are, in concentrated form, among the most powerful naturally occurring psychoactive substances known to exist. Ergot poisoning was a recurring crisis in medieval Europe. When ergot-contaminated rye was milled and baked into bread, the alkaloid survived the baking process and entered the bodies of everyone who ate from that batch. The symptoms progressed from tingling in the extremities to convulsions to hallucinations to the constriction of blood vessels so severe that affected limbs developed gangrene and fell away. The disease had several names. It was called ignis sacer, holy fire, for the burning sensation it produced in the extremities. It was called Saint Anthony's fire, because the monastic order of Saint Anthony was associated with its care, and because pilgrims who traveled to the shrine of Saint Anthony often recovered. Medieval people understood this as miracle. The actual explanation was simpler and more mundane. The journey away from home took them away from the contaminated grain supply and toward uncontaminated food. They got better because they stopped eating the bread that was making them ill. They had no way of knowing this. Ergotism is the most dramatic of the dangers that medieval bread could present, but ordinary, uncontaminated bread also damaged people in subtler ways. Vitamin deficiencies, particularly vitamin C, D, and A, were endemic among people whose diet consisted largely of bread and very little else. The consequences were rickets in children, scurvy in adults, night blindness, compromised immune function. These were not understood as nutritional deficiencies, because the concept of vitamins did not yet exist. They were simply conditions that people had, misfortunes of constitution, divine will, the ordinary terms of a life that was shorter and harder than ours, and yet, and this matters, and deserves to be said plainly, medieval bread was also real in a way that our bread is not. It was made by human hands, from grain that human hands had grown and harvested and ground. It smelled like something when it came from the oven, the specific combination of grain and starter and local water and the smoke of the particular fire over which it baked. A loaf made in a village in the Cotswolds smelled different from a loaf made in a village in Normandy, and the person who ate it knew the difference because they had eaten both, and because the bread was connected to the specific place and specific season in a way that industrially produced bread cannot be. Medieval bread was not good, by the standards of our nutrition science and our food safety knowledge. It was also not nothing. It was the center of daily life, the substance around which everything else organized, the difference between eating and not eating, between living and the particular quiet desperation of hunger that visited medieval households with a regularity that we have largely forgotten how to imagine. Every morning, someone in every medieval household got up before the rest and moved to the hearth to rebuild the fire from last night's embers. Every morning, the question of bread, whether there was enough, whether the grain would hold until the next harvest, whether this winter was going to be harder than the last, was present, not as a conscious worry but as the background condition of everything, the way the cold is present in winter, simply a fact that the day must be organized around. The pottage that fed the world. If bread was the foundation of medieval eating, pottage was the building that rose on top of it, pottage. The word has almost vanished from everyday English. You might encounter it in historical fiction, or in the biblical story of Esau who sold his birthright for a mess of it. But for most ordinary people in medieval Europe, pottage was not a literary reference. It was dinner. It was, very often, every meal. Day after day, through the seasons and the years and the decades of an ordinary life, the pot hung over the fire and the pottage simmered. Pottage was, at its most basic, a cooked mixture of grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available, simmered together in water in a pot suspended over the fire. The word comes from the French potage, meaning food cooked in a pot, and that functional simplicity is the point. Pottage was not a recipe. It was a method. A way of making something edible and warm from whatever happened to be at hand on a given day in a given household in a given season, using the universal technology of heat and water and time. The pot in which pottage was made was one of the most important objects in a medieval household, more important than furniture, in many cases, because furniture was a luxury and the pot was a necessity. Iron pots were expensive and carefully maintained. When they cracked or developed holes they were repaired if possible and replaced only when repair was no longer possible. Ceramic pots were more fragile but more accessible to poorer households. The pot hung from an iron hook or rested on a trivet over the fire, and it was rarely, in many households, entirely empty or entirely clean. The residue of previous meals contributed to the flavor of the next. The fat from last week's small piece of salt pork enriched the pottage being made today. The root vegetables that hadn't fully softened yesterday were still there in the pot, continuing to cook, becoming part of tomorrow's meal. This continuous cooking, the pot that was always on, always simmering, always incorporating the previous meal into the next, was not sloppiness or inattention. It was economy. Nothing wasted. Every particle of food value extracted from every ingredient, because every ingredient had cost something in labor or money or both. A prosperous peasant's pottage might contain a range of ingredients that, taken together, represented something approaching a complete diet. Dried peas were the most important legume in the medieval world, a reliable source of plant protein that grew well in northern European climates and could be stored through winter without special treatment. Onions, which were grown everywhere and kept reasonably well, contributed both flavor and nutritional value. Leeks, similarly ubiquitous and similarly useful. Turnips, parsnips, cabbages, the root vegetables and brassicas that formed the agricultural backbone of medieval European peasant gardens, the plants that could be coaxed from northern European soil and that could be stored or remained in the ground through frost. In summer, fresh herbs from the garden were added to the pot: parsley, sage, thyme, mint, lovage, and others whose names have been partly lost to us because they were used by people who did not write about what they were doing. These herbs were not added for aesthetic reasons, though they did improve flavor. They were functional. Some had mild preservative properties that extended the safety of food in a world without refrigeration, while others contributed to the humoral balance of the dish in the medical framework of the period. The herb garden was maintained with care because it served both culinary and medicinal functions simultaneously, without any distinction between the two. A poor peasant's pottage was something quite different, and the difference was not merely one of degree. In years of poor harvest, or in the hungry weeks between winter's end and the first spring vegetables, pottage might be little more than water with a handful of whatever grain could be spared from the stores that were supposed to last until the new harvest: barley or oats, simmered until they softened into a gray, thick paste of minimal flavor and barely adequate caloric content. This was consumed not because it was good but because it was what there was, and what there was had to serve. The fire that cooked the pottage was managed with skills entirely unconscious, built into the hands and mind of the cook through years of daily practice, never formally taught, never articulated as a set of principles, simply known in the way that the body knows things it has done thousands of times. Medieval cooks had no thermometers or timers. They judged heat by the behavior of the flame and the sound of the liquid and the smell that rose from the pot and the particular pattern of bubbles at the surface that told an experienced eye whether the simmer was right or whether the fire needed more wood or less. This knowledge was as sophisticated as any modern culinary technique, and perhaps more so in one important sense: it was adaptive. A modern cook following a recipe in a temperature-controlled environment is executing an instruction. A medieval cook managing a wood fire was reading and responding to a dynamic system in real time, adjusting constantly, exercising the judgment that comes from understanding the behavior of the specific fuel available in the specific fire in the specific weather of the specific day. You cannot write that knowledge down. You can only transmit it through presence and practice. The time required to make pottage was substantial, and this time was inseparable from the rest of the household's daily life. The vegetables had to be gathered from the garden or retrieved from storage. They had to be prepared by hand, peeled, chopped, cleaned with whatever water was available. The grain had to be measured from the household's carefully managed stores. The fire had to be built or revived. The pot had to be watched and tended, the liquid replenished as it evaporated. A simple pottage might take 2 hours from beginning to serving. A more complex one might simmer all day, the cook returning to it repeatedly between other tasks. Pottage was eaten from wooden bowls, or from hollowed rounds of bread, or, in the poorest households, directly from a shared pot if individual bowls were not available. Spoons were universal even in the poorest houses, carved from local wood, simple, used for everything. The table manners of the medieval period were different from modern ones but were not random. There were conventions, expectations, things that were done and things that were not done, and these varied by social class and context and the particular culture of the region and the household. Even in poverty, people had dignity at the table. There is something worth sitting with here, in the quiet space between the observations. In a world without the option of variety, where the question was not what to have for dinner but whether dinner would be adequate, the relationship with food was necessarily different from ours. Boredom with food requires the expectation of variety. Medieval people whose diet rarely varied were not experiencing boredom in any simple sense. They were simply eating what they had, in the way that the sea simply behaves as the sea behaves. When the pottage was full and hot and there was bread beside it, this was satisfaction, genuine, bodily satisfaction, unmediated by the comparison to better options that modern abundance makes inevitable. The hunger that visited in the lean months made the full pot more meaningful. That is not romanticism. It is the straightforward arithmetic of scarcity, and its opposite, the pot simmered. The steam rose through the smoke hole in the thatch. The household gathered around the fire when the day's work was done, tired in the specific, complete way of people who have used their bodies fully, and ate together from the same pot. This was dinner, for most of 1,000 years. The mystery of medieval meat. The word carries weight in every culture that has known scarcity. A specific, anticipatory quality that distinguishes it from vegetables or grain, the weight of protein, of fat, of the animal life that was taken for it, of the labor that produced it. In medieval Europe, this weight was not metaphorical. It was class. It was status. It was the physical, daily marker of where you stood in the hierarchy that organized everything. For most ordinary people, the peasants who constituted somewhere between 80 and 90% of the population of medieval Europe, meat was rare. Not absent necessarily, but rare enough that its presence at a meal was noticed, was significant, was associated with specific occasions rather than with everyday eating. A working adult on a typical medieval peasant diet consumed perhaps a small amount of salt pork 2 or 3 times a week in the better years, supplemented by whatever small birds or rabbits or freshwater creatures could be legally obtained. In worse years, in lean seasons, the meat disappeared from the pot entirely. The game laws of medieval Europe were one of the more quietly brutal mechanisms of the social order. Forest game, deer, wild boar, the large animals that we associate with medieval hunting through art and literature, was legally the property of the king or the lord. A peasant caught taking a deer from the lord's forest faced punishments that ranged from heavy fines to mutilation to death, depending on the period, the jurisdiction, and the mood of the local authority. The New Forest, created by William the Conqueror in the 11th century by clearing villages and farmland, was a personal hunting ground for the king maintained at the direct expense of the people who had lived on that land. The forest was more valuable to power than the people who farmed it. The purpose of these laws was not purely recreational. It was economic and political. The forest was a source of protein, of timber, of various products that medieval economies depended on, and controlling the forest meant controlling a significant portion of the region's productive capacity. A nobility that held exclusive rights to the large game of the forest held exclusive rights to a form of protein that the rest of the population could only access through their charity or in violation of the law. Food as power is one of the oldest mechanisms of social control, and medieval game law was one of its most explicit expressions. The pig was the animal of the ordinary medieval person, the animal that made meat possible for those who could not hunt and could not afford the beef or mutton that required larger landholdings to produce. Pigs were efficient converters of waste into protein. They ate kitchen scraps, food that was not fit for human consumption, rooted in the forest margin for acorns and roots when the season and the local law permitted. They were not fussy, not delicate, not expensive to maintain in a basic way. A peasant family could keep a pig on what they could spare from their own table. The annual autumn pig slaughter was one of the defining events of the medieval peasant agricultural year. Every part of the animal was used. Every part. The flesh was salted and smoked and preserved for winter eating. The fat was rendered into lard, used for cooking and for lamp fuel and for waterproofing leather and for a dozen other applications. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausages into which the scraps and offal were packed along with seasoning. The blood was cooked into black pudding. The bones were boiled for stock. Even the bristles had uses. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could afford to be wasted. Salt pork, the preserved flesh, salted heavily to prevent spoilage, was the most common form in which meat appeared in ordinary medieval diets. It was not fresh. It was dense with salt and often somewhat rancid by the time it was used, particularly in spring when the winter supply was nearly exhausted. But it was protein, and it was fat, and both were precious. Even a small piece of salt pork added to the pottage transformed the dish, the fat enriching the liquid, the salt flavoring everything, the tiny quantity of animal protein providing what the grains and vegetables could not. The piece of salt pork in the pottage was not incidental. It was the meal's nutritional justification. Chickens were kept primarily for eggs rather than meat in most medieval households. A laying hen was more economically valuable alive than dead, because she produced food continuously rather than once. Chickens were eaten when they stopped laying, or when a feast demanded it, or when illness or accident provided the unexpected occasion. The medieval chicken was a very different animal from the commodity chicken of modern industrial agriculture, older, tougher, more flavorful, having lived a working life of foraging and laying. Such a bird required long, slow cooking to become tender. A half day in a pot with herbs and vegetables would transform it into something genuinely good, a broth rich with fat and flavor, the meat finally soft enough to eat. The particular ache of medieval meat scarcity is difficult to convey to someone who has never experienced it, who has never wanted something specific and edible and been unable to obtain it not for a day or a week but for months, perhaps for seasons. We can understand it intellectually, but the body's understanding of it, the specific, physical quality of wanting protein and fat that you cannot have, is something that most modern people in wealthy countries have never felt with any continuity. When meat was available in larger quantities, at harvest festivals, at Christmas, at Easter, at the feast days that structured the medieval year, it was consumed with a deliberateness that reflected its scarcity. People ate a great deal of meat when they had it, because they did not know when they would have it again. This is not gluttony in any morally meaningful sense. It is the rational behavior of people who understood, from direct experience, that abundance was temporary and might not return on any predictable schedule. The feast was genuine in a way that feasting is when it is the exception to a rule of ordinary want. Ale, the drink that kept people alive. If you were transported to medieval Europe and needed to drink something safely, anything at all, the answer was ale. Not water. Not river water, not well water, not spring water collected in a barrel. Water was dangerous in the medieval world in ways that were not understood and therefore could not be systematically prevented. Medieval people did not know about bacteria or waterborne pathogens. They did not know why drinking from the river that passed through the town made you ill. But they knew, from accumulated, painful, generational experience, that it very often did. People who drank from rivers that flowed through populated areas died of dysentery and typhoid and cholera with a consistency that made those water sources objects of reasonable suspicion even without the scientific understanding to explain the danger. The practical conclusion, avoid unboiled water, drink ale, was correct even without the correct explanation for why it was correct. Ale was safer because the brewing process killed or inhibited most of the pathogens that made untreated water lethal. The boiling of water with grain during the mashing process, followed by fermentation, produced a beverage that was microbiologically much safer than anything drawn from a medieval water source. This was not understood as public health. It was simply what you did. Ale was what people drank, because experience had demonstrated that people who drank ale were generally less ill than people who drank water, and in a world organized around practical experience rather than scientific theory, that observation was sufficient. Medieval ale was very different from modern beer. It was unhopped. Hops, which give modern beer its characteristic bitterness and contribute significantly to its preservation, were not in common use in England until the late medieval period, imported from the continent as a relatively novel ingredient regarded initially with suspicion. English brewers of the early and high medieval period used other herbs and plants, grut, a proprietary mixture of herbs whose specific composition varied by region and was often a trade secret, to flavor and preserve their product. The result was sweeter, cloudier, and much less shelf-stable than modern beer. Unhopped ale soured within a few days and went off entirely within a week or two. This meant that ale had to be brewed continuously, in small batches, as a regular household activity rather than a periodic production event. A household that brewed ale weekly was managing a significant ongoing commitment of time, equipment, fuel, and grain. The grain used for brewing, typically barley, malted to convert its starches to fermentable sugars before brewing, was grain that could not be eaten directly. The decision to brew ale was a choice about how to allocate the household's limited grain supply. The alcoholic content of medieval ale was generally low by modern standards, typically somewhere between 1 and 4% alcohol by volume, with considerable variation depending on the strength of the brew and the proportion of grain to water. This is important for understanding its role in daily life. Medieval ale was not consumed primarily to produce intoxication. It was consumed as a daily beverage, in quantities that would render modern drinkers useless if they assumed the strength of contemporary beer. An adult worker might drink several pints of ale per day, not to get drunk, but because they were thirsty and this was what was safe to drink. Children drank ale, in smaller quantities, from early ages. The elderly drank ale. Sick people drank ale, often on the advice of physicians who considered it warming and nourishing. Ale was the water of medieval life, ubiquitous, daily, unremarkable, used without ceremony or particular attention. A modern person finding this disturbing is reacting appropriately to the information but missing the context. In a world where the alternative was genuinely dangerous water, ale was not a vice. It was a public health solution that worked, imperfectly, for centuries. The nutritional contribution of ale was also real. Brewing grain produces a liquid that retains some of the grain's B vitamins, and B vitamin deficiency was common in medieval diets that depended heavily on processed grain and lacked fresh vegetables through the winter months. The ale did not fully compensate for the nutritional inadequacies of the medieval diet, but it was not merely empty calories. It contributed, in a modest way, to maintaining the health of people who had limited other sources for certain nutrients. Brewing was, in most medieval households, the work of women. The alewife, the woman who brewed and often sold ale, was a significant social figure in medieval English towns, identifiable by the long pole hung outside her door that signaled ale was available for purchase, the precursor of the pub sign. The alewife occupied an ambiguous position in the medieval social imagination, necessary and relied upon, her product consumed by everyone from the lord to the poorest laborer, and yet associated in moralizing literature with dishonesty, with selling watered or soured ale, with the petty corruptions that popular culture associated with female commercial activity. This association says more about the culture that produced it than about the alewives themselves. Women who exercised commercial independence, who had their own products, their own prices, their own commercial relationships with the community, occupied a position that the culture was uncomfortable with, and the stereotype of the dishonest alewife was one of the mechanisms by which that discomfort was expressed and managed. Most alewives were simply doing what they did, feeding their households and contributing to the community's access to safe drink, as they had always done. The monastery was also a major ale producer in many regions, with resources and organizational capacity that individual household brewers could not match. Monastic ale was often more consistent in quality, produced in larger quantities, and available to travelers and the poor in ways that supplemented the household brewing of the surrounding community. The monastery cellar, the responsibility of the cellarer, one of the most important officers of the community, was well stocked with ale throughout the year, the careful management of the supply through all seasons a significant part of the cellarer's ongoing responsibility. There is something almost peaceful about the image of the medieval relationship with ale. Not the contemporary association with pubs and social drinking and the various complications of alcohol in modern life. Something quieter and more functional. The morning ale with bread. The midday ale with whatever was available to eat in the field. The evening ale after the day's labor, drunk at the table or beside the fire. The continuity of it, the ordinariness of it. People who needed to drink something and had learned, over centuries, what was safe. Spices and the secrets they kept. There is a spice rack in most modern kitchens. Small jars or bottles, containing substances that have traveled from their countries of origin through a processing factory, through a warehouse, through a store to your kitchen, at a cost of a few dollars each. Cumin, coriander, turmeric, cloves, cinnamon. You use them without particular ceremony. They are simply available. This ordinariness is one of the most historically recent things about the modern kitchen. The history of how these substances became ordinary is, in miniature, the history of the last 5 centuries of global trade. And the condition before that history, the medieval condition in which these same substances were among the most valuable commodities traded in the known world, is so different from the present that it requires a genuine act of historical imagination to grasp. A pound of pepper, black pepper, the most common and basic of the spices we take for granted, was worth, in different periods of the medieval era, the equivalent of several days' wages for a skilled worker. Not a pound of rare spice, not an exotic substance obtainable only from distant lands known to few people, but pepper, which every European of means used regularly and which appears in virtually every recipe in the surviving medieval cookbooks. Expensive, deeply expensive by the standards of ordinary life, and yet used constantly by those who could afford it. A pound of saffron, the dried stigmas of the crocus flower, still today the most expensive spice in the world by weight, was worth more than gold in some medieval markets. Not as a figure of speech, the exchange rate between saffron and gold bullion was literally calculated and recorded in medieval merchant accounts. Cloves, nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon, each was a luxury of the first order, traded across thousands of miles of sea and land from the spice islands of Indonesia, the coasts of India, the forests of Ceylon, to the ports of the Mediterranean, where Italian merchants, the Venetians above all, controlled access to the European market and built the fortunes that constructed the cathedrals and funded the art that defines our image of the period. The question that must follow is, why? Why were these substances so valued that they organized the political and commercial economy of an entire civilization? The popular answer, that spices were used to mask the taste of spoiled meat, is largely a myth, and a myth worth dispelling carefully. Medieval people who could afford spices could also afford reasonably fresh or adequately preserved meat. The economics of applying extremely expensive spices to mask the flavor of spoiled meat make no sense. The spice cost more than the meat. You would simply not do this. You would either obtain better meat or eat less meat. No rational household management produces the conclusion that destroying the value of your most expensive ingredients by applying them to food you should throw away is the right approach. The actual reasons for the value of spices were multiple and more interesting than the spoiled meat theory allows. First and most directly, flavor. Medieval food, even for the wealthy, was limited in its variety in ways that made the flavor enhancement of spices genuinely valuable. The capacity to make food taste interesting, complex, different from what it was without the spice, this was worth paying for, as it is worth paying for in every culture at every period of history. Food that tastes good is a pleasure, and pleasure has always had economic value. Second, medicine. The medieval medical framework, derived from Greek sources, transmitted through Arabic scholarship, organized around the theory of the four humors, classified foods and drugs on a scale of hot, cold, wet, and dry qualities. Health was understood as the balance of these qualities in the body, and disease as imbalance. Spices were almost universally classified as hot and dry, making them medically useful for correcting cold and wet imbalances. They were prescribed by physicians for a range of conditions, prepared in specific combinations and doses by apothecaries, administered to patients as treatments. The same substances that appeared in the cook's preparation appeared in the physician's prescription. The boundary between kitchen and pharmacy was porous in the medieval world in ways it is not for us. Cooking and medicine shared ingredients, shared knowledge, shared the fundamental assumption that what you put in your body had consequences for your health that could be managed if you understood the principles involved. Spices were food and medicine simultaneously, without any contradiction between these functions. Third, display. In a world where social hierarchy was expressed through every available medium, clothing, housing, behavior, language, the food you served was a powerful statement about your resources and your position. Serving food flavored with imported spices, substances that traveled thousands of miles and cost considerable sums, was the medieval equivalent of displaying a luxury brand. It told your guests something specific about your household's reach, your commercial connections, your wealth. The smell of cinnamon and cloves and ginger coming from the kitchen before the feast was itself a form of social communication, announcing what kind of feast this was going to be before the first dish appeared. The trade routes that brought spices to Europe were extraordinary achievements of the pre-modern world. The Silk Road and its maritime equivalents connected the spice islands of eastern Indonesia to the courts of Europe through dozens of intermediary hands, Arab merchants on the Indian Ocean, Persian middlemen in the Persian Gulf, Egyptian traders in the Red Sea, Venetian and Genoese merchants in the Mediterranean. Each hand added cost and markup. The spice that left its plant in Banda or Ceylon arrived in a Paris kitchen at a price that reflected the entire geography of the medieval world's commercial connections. The desire to break the Italian monopoly on this trade, to find new routes to the spice sources that did not pass through Venetian hands, was one of the primary commercial motivations of the European age of exploration that began in the late 15th century. Columbus, sailing west in 1492, was looking for a route to the Spice Islands when he found the Americas. Vasco da Gama, rounding Africa in 1498, reached India and returned with a cargo of spices worth 60 times the cost of his voyage. The world was changed by the desire to make food taste better, or rather, by the desire to control the supply of the substances that made food taste better at a profit. In the great medieval kitchen, the spice cabinet was kept locked, its key in the hands of the household officer who had authority over it. The spices were measured out carefully, their use recorded, their acquisition planned as a significant item in the household budget. Running out of pepper was an administrative failure. Obtaining new supplies required expenditure and planning. The locked cabinet, the careful accounting, the key carried by the person of authority, these details speak to what spices meant in the medieval world. Not flavoring. Not a convenience. A resource, managed like any other resource that was valuable and limited and whose proper use made the difference between a good household and a failing one. The monastery kitchen. In the medieval world, if you wanted to eat regularly, reasonably well, and with some degree of predictability across the seasons, there were worse places to be than a monastery. The monastery kitchen occupied a specific and important place in the medieval food landscape. It was, in many regions, the most sophisticated, best resourced, and most consistently productive kitchen available. Not because monks were gourmands, though some were, but because monasteries were, in the absence of most of the institutional structures that modern societies take for granted, attempting to do the work of those structures simultaneously. Feeding themselves. Feeding the sick. Feeding travelers. Feeding the poor who came to their gates. Feeding the laborers who worked their lands. And feeding the guests who visited the abbot, whose hospitality reflected on the community. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and adopted, with local variations, by most of the major monastic orders of Western Europe through the medieval period, governed the monks' relationship with food in considerable practical detail. The rule was not vague or aspirational in its food provisions. It specified how many meals would be served and when, what categories of food were permitted and what were not, what exceptions existed for the sick and the young and the very old, how the quantity of food related to the heaviness of the day's labor. Benedictine monks ate 2 meals a day in the warmer months, one at midday and one in the evening. In winter, when days were short and labor was lighter, they might eat only once. These meals were taken in the refectory, the communal dining hall, in silence, while a designated reader stood at a lectern and read aloud from scripture or from the hagiographic literature of the Church's saints. The combination of shared eating and shared listening was an expression of the Benedictine understanding that even the bodily necessity of eating was an opportunity for the formation of the spirit, that the meal was a kind of liturgy, ordered and purposeful and oriented toward something beyond the satisfaction of hunger. The prohibition on meat from 4-footed animals that the rule contained was not observed uniformly across the medieval period. Interpretations proliferated. The sick were always exempt. The definition of the sick expanded, over centuries of interpretation, in directions that allowed considerable flexibility. The most common accommodation was the development of the misericorde, literally, the room of mercy, where meat could be served to monks who needed it for medical reasons, with the definition of medical need left to considerable latitude in many communities. As the centuries passed and monastic wealth grew and monastic discipline relaxed in various periods, the meat prohibition became more honored in the breach than in the observance in many communities. What the monasteries ate abundantly and without restriction was fish, and fish in the medieval monastic context meant an astonishing variety and volume of aquatic life, approached with the same systematic thoroughness that the monastic temperament brought to everything it undertook. Fish ponds, vivaria, were constructed as standard elements of monastic site planning, positioned near reliable water sources, stocked with carp, pike, tench, bream, perch, and roach. The fish pond was managed as a productive ecosystem, breeding populations maintained, growth monitored, harvesting scheduled to preserve the pond's long-term productivity. The monastic garden was another point of distinction. The hortus, the kitchen garden, was a standard element of monastic planning, and monastic gardens were among the most productive and sophisticated in the medieval world. Monks cultivated vegetables and herbs and fruit trees with systematic care, maintaining records of what grew well and what did not, adapting varieties and cultivation practices over generations of observation. Monastic manuscripts frequently included plant lists, cultivation instructions, and medicinal recipes that constitute some of the most detailed agricultural literature of the medieval period. The cellarer was one of the most important officers of the medieval monastery, the person responsible for the procurement, storage, and management of all food and drink. A good cellarer needed to understand agriculture, trade, nutrition, preservation, and accounting simultaneously. The cellarer held the keys to the storehouse, managed the budget for food procurement, negotiated with suppliers in the surrounding market, ensured that the community would have enough to eat through the year, and planned the significant variations in the diet that the liturgical calendar required. The monastic kitchen itself was typically a substantial, carefully organized structure, separate from the main buildings to reduce fire risk, built around a central hearth large enough to support the pots and spits needed to cook for a community of dozens or hundreds. In larger monasteries, specialist cooks, monks assigned to kitchen duties on a rotating schedule, supported by lay servants who performed the more physically demanding tasks, produced food in quantities and with a consistency that the ordinary village household could not approach. The monastery also served as the primary source of hospitality for travelers in many regions, fulfilling the obligation expressed in the rule's provision that all guests should be received as Christ. Monasteries maintained guest houses, provided meals to travelers of all social classes, though with distinctions in the quality of the hospitality offered, and extended the food resources of the community to those passing through in a world without the commercial hospitality infrastructure of later centuries. The traveler who reached a monastery gate as evening fell could expect, in most well-governed communities, to be fed and housed for the night. There is something genuinely appealing about the monastery kitchen, viewed from the outside. The orderliness of it. The continuity, the same meals, in the same sequence, in the same place, year after year, decade after decade, the liturgical calendar providing the variations that marked the season and the feast. The community aspect, the shared table and the shared reading. The serious, practical attention to the provision of food as a form of care for the people who depended on it. Not glamorous. Not creative in the modern sense. But reliable, organized, and consistently better than what most people had access to in the world outside the walls. Famine, when the food simply stopped, there is a particular kind of silence that descends on this story when we come to famine. The story that was, until this moment, about what people ate becomes, here, the story of what was not there. The story of absence. Of the particular quality of absence when what is absent is food, famine was not exceptional in medieval Europe. It was structural. It was embedded in the normal functioning of the medieval agricultural system, not an external catastrophe that arrived from outside the ordinary order of things, but a consequence of the ordinary order of things in a world where the difference between a good harvest and a bad one was the entire margin between enough and disaster. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is the most extensively documented and most geographically widespread famine of the medieval period in Western Europe. It began with the failure of the 1315 harvest, following a summer of extraordinary rainfall that prevented grain from ripening across a vast geography: Flanders, northern France, England, Germany, Scandinavia, much of the British Isles. The rain did not stop. 1316 was worse. The fields that should have been worked in spring were flooded or too wet to plow. The grain that was planted rotted in the ground. The livestock that needed to be fed through the winter when the grass stopped growing died of starvation before spring. The famine continued through 1317, 1318, 1319, and beyond, as successive harvest failures compounded the accumulated depletion of reserves that healthy years had built. The stores of grain that a prudent household maintained against a single bad year were exhausted in the first year. The seed grain set aside for the following year's planting was eaten in the second year, meaning the 1317 harvest was compromised before it was even planted. The breeding livestock was slaughtered for food, destroying the future capacity to produce more livestock. Each desperate response to immediate hunger created the conditions for future hunger. The death toll was enormous by any measure, though the precision of medieval record-keeping does not allow the exact figures that modern demographic analysis would require. Historians estimate that between 10 and 25% of the population of affected regions died in direct consequence of the Great Famine, not all from outright starvation, because outright starvation is actually a slow death that the body resists for a long time, but from the cascade of consequences that severe and sustained malnutrition produces. Malnourished bodies cannot fight infections that well-nourished bodies might survive. The immune system that operates on adequate protein and vitamins is a fundamentally different system from the immune system that has been running on bare minimum calories for 6 months. Diseases that circulate through a community with normal frequency, respiratory infections, gastroenteritis, the range of illnesses that accompany winter in any pre-modern population, became killers in populations that had no nutritional reserve to draw on in fighting them. The chroniclers of the Great Famine wrote with a directness about what they witnessed that is difficult to read. People eating horses, then dogs, then cats. People stripping bark from trees and boiling it in water and eating it. People found dead in the roads and in the fields with grass in their mouths, grass that they had tried to eat and that had not sustained them. Accounts of cannibalism appear in multiple independent sources, though historians debate which of these accounts are literally accurate and which represent the hyperbolic language of extreme distress. The direction of the accounts, the extremity they describe, is consistent enough across independent sources to suggest that whatever the specific facts, the conditions were genuinely catastrophic. The price of grain during the Great Famine rose to multiples of its normal level. A quarter of wheat that had sold for 12 pence in normal times sold for 40 pence, then 60, then more. Wages for agricultural laborers did not rise proportionally. The poor who could not afford bread at normal prices could not afford it at famine prices. The institutional charity that existed, monasteries distributing bread at their gates, parishes collecting alms for the hungry, was overwhelmed by a scale of need that exceeded the capacity of any existing mechanism of response. There was not enough. The people with resources could eat. The people without resources could not. The Great Famine ended because the weather improved, not because anything in the agricultural or social system was reformed. The rains moderated. The sun came back. Grain grew. The surviving population, reduced, weakened, altered by the experience, returned to the business of growing food and managing the margin between enough and not enough, as they always had. 25 years later, the Black Death arrived and killed somewhere between a third and a half of what remained. But in the ordinary years, the years between the great crises, the years when the harvest was adequate and the stores held through winter, people ate. They were often hungry in the chronic, low-level way of people who never quite have enough, but they were not starving. They ate their bread and their pottage and their salt pork and their ale, and they managed the agricultural cycle with all the knowledge and care they possessed, and most years, most of them stayed on the right side of the margin was thin. It was always thin. But for most people, in most years, it held. What the rich really ate. We have been sitting in the peasant's kitchen. It is time to enter the great hall. The contrast between what the poor ate and what the wealthy ate in medieval Europe was not merely a matter of quantity, more of the same food, in larger portions, with seconds available. It was a difference in kind, in category, in the entire social and symbolic meaning of the meal. The food of the medieval elite was not simply abundant peasant food. It was different food, different animals, different preparation methods, different seasonings, different service, different purpose. The gap between the nobleman's feast and the peasant's pottage was wider than any contemporary gap between rich and poor eating, because the medieval social order was organized, in part, around maintaining and displaying that gap as a fact of nature. The defining food of the medieval elite was roasted meat. Not salt pork or boiled fowl or the preserved proteins of ordinary life, but fresh roasted meat, whole animals or large joints, turned on a spit over an open fire, the turning done by a person or occasionally by mechanical means, requiring constant attention, the periodic basting with fat and herbs, the careful management of the fire's heat for the hours required to cook a large joint through without burning the exterior. Roasted meat was labor-intensive in a way that pottage was not. It required dedicated equipment, significant fuel, and the sustained attention of skilled workers. It smelled extraordinary, the fat dripping and sizzling in the fire below, the herbs crisping on the surface, the browning exterior developing the complex flavors that the Maillard reaction produces. It was impossible to produce it quietly or cheaply. That was precisely the point. The Fermi of Curry, a cookbook produced by the master cooks of King Richard II of England in the late 14th century, provides a window into the sophistication of elite medieval cooking that reveals something genuinely extraordinary. The recipes describe dishes of considerable technical complexity: blancmange made from capon, ground almonds, sugar, and rice flour, carefully seasoned with salt and enriched with the fat of the bird, mortars of fish and flesh, which were sophisticated force-meat preparations, stuffed preparations where one animal was placed inside another, and the subtleties, the elaborate sculptures made from sugar or almond paste, or from meat products formed and decorated to represent castles, ships, animals, heraldic devices, that were placed on the Lord's table not to be eaten but to be admired, then perhaps dismantled and distributed as the feast progressed. The subtlety was one of the more extraordinary expressions of medieval elite food culture. Creating a sugar sculpture of a castle, complete with crenellated battlements and pennants, or a ship with rigging made from spun sugar, or a heraldic beast life-sized and anatomically detailed, this was done in medieval kitchens by cooks who had no formal education in any modern sense, whose knowledge was entirely oral and practical, whose tools were limited to what fire and hand and simple implements could accomplish. The knowledge was real. The skill was real. The results were impressive by the standards of any period. The meats available to the wealthy were a taxonomy of prestige. Venison, the flesh of deer, was the prestige meat of the medieval aristocracy, the specific protein whose consumption marked you as a person with hunting rights, with forest access, with the noble status that hunting symbolized. Hunting was not merely recreation, it was a practice loaded with political and social meaning. The right to hunt, and the specific animals you were entitled to hunt, said something precise about your position in the hierarchy. Eating venison said the same thing again at the table. Beyond venison, the wealthy ate boar, hare, pheasant, partridge, swan, peacock, heron, crane, bittern, and a range of other birds and mammals that the poor could not legally or economically access. Swan and peacock were particularly prestigious. They were served whole at great feasts, roasted but then dressed again in their own skins and feathers for presentation, brought to the table appearing alive, the peacock's tail spread behind the serving dish in a display of theatrical abundance. The feast was a performance, and the food was both substance and spectacle. The spices that we discussed in their own section were deployed in elite cooking with a liberality that reflected their function as displays of wealth rather than merely as flavoring agents. A sauce that combined cinnamon, ginger, cloves, pepper, and saffron was making a statement about the household's resources as much as a culinary choice. The medieval cookbook recipe that calls for a pound of pepper and half a pound of ginger is not a practical cooking instruction that most modern cooks would follow. It is evidence of a context in which the deployment of such quantities was a reasonable and expected expression of the feast's appropriate level of extravagance. The service of a great medieval feast was as elaborate as its food. Household officers, the carver, who cut meat at the table with specific knives and specific techniques, the server, who presented each dish in the correct sequence with the correct protocol, the cupbearer, who managed the wine service, performed their functions as a kind of choreography, each gesture governed by conventions that expressed the social order of the household. The Lord sat at the high table, elevated above the other diners, the physical architecture of the room making visible the hierarchy that the seating arrangements confirmed. Between the peasant's bowl and the Lord's feast lay the entirety of medieval social inequality. The food expressed it. The food enforced it. Every day, multiple times a day, the difference between what the wealthy ate and what the poor ate was a physical, immediate, bodily experience for everyone involved. The wealthy experienced it as abundance and entitlement. The poor experienced it as the background condition of their lives, not necessarily as injustice in the way that our political vocabulary would frame it, because the medieval framework did not provide the concepts for that framing, but as simply the way the world was. Preservation, keeping food alive through winter. The medieval world had no refrigerator. This sentence is obvious enough to pass without its full weight landing. Let it land: no refrigerator. No freezer. No icebox, no controlled cold storage of any kind except the natural cold of winter, which was useful but inconsistent and completely absent in the warmer months. Everything that spoils, everything that bacteria can colonize and transform, spoiled in the medieval world at the natural rate of biological decay, which in summer is quite fast. The question of how to eat through winter, how to make the food that the harvest produced available through the months when nothing grew, was one of the central technical challenges of medieval life. Salt was the most important preservative in the medieval world, and the salt trade was one of the most significant economic enterprises of the period. Salt's preservative action operates by reducing the water activity in food, drawing moisture from the food and creating an environment with insufficient free water to support the growth of most spoilage organisms. It works on meat, on fish, on vegetables, on almost anything that will absorb it, and it had been used for preservation since before written history. Medieval salt came from two primary sources: sea salt, produced in salt pans along the coastal regions of France and Portugal and the Bay of Biscay, where the Atlantic climate allowed the evaporation of seawater in shallow pans through the summer months, and rock salt, mined from underground deposits in Central Europe, particularly in what is now Germany and Poland. The salt trade connected these production areas to the inland populations of Europe through a commercial network of considerable complexity, managed by merchants who understood the seasonal nature of both production and demand. The salting of pork at the autumn pig slaughter was the most important annual preservation event in a typical medieval peasant household. The animal that had been fattened through summer was killed in October or November, and the processing of its carcass consumed several days of the household's concentrated effort. The fresh cuts that could be eaten immediately were eaten immediately, shared with neighbors and family in an informal feast that was one of the periodic high points of the agricultural year. The rest, the bulk of the animal, was packed in salt or rubbed with salt and hung in a cool, dry location to cure. The salt drew moisture from the meat through osmosis, inhibiting bacterial growth and enzymatic decay, transforming fresh pork into salt pork that could be stored for months without becoming dangerous, though it did become increasingly strong in flavor and increasingly dense in texture as the cure progressed. The salt pork of late winter and early spring, drawn from the diminishing stores of the previous autumn slaughter, was a different eating experience from the cured meat of November, but it was still protein, still fat, still the thing that made the pottage into a meal rather than merely a pot of vegetables. Smoking was frequently combined with salting. Wood smoke contains phenols, aldehydes, and organic acids that penetrate the surface of food and create a hostile chemical environment for spoilage organisms, while simultaneously contributing the flavor that we still associate with smoked foods. A smoked and salted side of bacon, stored in a cool, dark place, could remain edible through a medieval winter and into spring, not fresh, not pleasant by the standards of food that has not been heavily processed, but safe, caloric, and sufficient. Fish preservation through salting was a major industry of the medieval economy, organized at a scale that dwarfed household preservation. The North Sea herring fishery was one of the most productive fisheries in the world during the medieval period, and the herring that it produced was salted at sea or on shore immediately after catching and packed into barrels for distribution across Europe. The barrels of salt herring moved inland along the river systems and road networks of medieval Europe, reaching populations hundreds of miles from any coastline, providing protein on the fasting days that the church calendar mandated. Salt cod, bacalhau, stockfish, was salted and dried so thoroughly that it became almost wood-like in its consistency, requiring 24 hours of soaking before it could be cooked, and lasting, if kept dry, for years. The stockfish trade connected the cod grounds of Iceland and northern Norway to the entire European interior through the Hanseatic merchant network, and the quality and volume of this trade was significant enough to shape the political relationships between the trading cities that managed it. Food preservation at the level of international commerce was inseparable from the politics of the period. Fermentation, the controlled action of specific microorganisms that produce acids or alcohols as byproducts, creating an environment hostile to the pathogens that cause spoilage, was used for vegetables, dairy, and grain. Sauerkraut, made by fermenting shredded cabbage in its own brine, was a winter staple in Germanic regions that provided something the medieval diet badly needed through the cold months: vitamin C, in a form that survived the winter without requiring fresh produce. Medieval people did not know about vitamin C. They knew that eating sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables seemed to prevent or cure the bleeding gums and fatigue that we now recognize as scurvy. That empirical knowledge, without the biochemical explanation, was enough. Root cellars, the underground or semi-underground storage spaces that maintained a cool, stable temperature through the insulating properties of the surrounding earth, stored root vegetables, apples, and other produce through winter. The earth maintained temperatures above freezing but below the temperatures at which most produce deteriorated quickly, extending the life of stored food by weeks or months. This technology required no energy input beyond the initial labor of construction. It used the thermal mass of the earth itself as a refrigerant. It was simple and effective and had been in use since the earliest periods of agricultural settlement. The entire system of medieval food preservation was a sustained, generationally accumulated engagement with the problem of time, the problem of making food that existed in abundance in summer available in scarcity in winter. It was not primitive. It was sophisticated within its constraints, refined through centuries of practice, maintained by a population for whom the alternative to getting it right was not merely unpleasant food but genuine hunger. The medieval cellar, with its barrels of salt herring and its crocks of pickled vegetables and its hanging sides of bacon and its sacks of dried peas, was the product of the same serious intelligence applied to a different problem than modern food technology addresses. The medieval market. On market day, the medieval town was transformed. Stalls appeared in the market square, set up in the early morning dark by traders who had traveled from surrounding villages and farms to sell what they had and buy what they needed. The streets that were quiet on ordinary days filled with the sound of voices and the movement of carts and animals, the particular dense activity of a place where commerce was happening and had been happening, in this same square, on this same day of the week, for generations. The butcher's stall was there, with cuts of meat hanging in the air, drawing flies in summer and freezing solid in winter. The smell of blood and fresh fat distinct and specific and impossible to replicate in a modern supermarket. The fish cellar, with barrels of salt herring and, near rivers, the occasional fresh catch laid on a bed of clean reeds. The baker with loaves of varying quality and price, the cheapest made from the cheapest grain, the best white wheat loaves priced for the households that could afford them. The alewife with her jug and cups. The medieval market was a food distribution system of considerable sophistication, though it would not have recognized itself in those terms. It was the place where agricultural surplus, the production of the surrounding farms beyond what those farms consumed, met the urban population that produced no food but needed to eat. It was the place where prices were set through the negotiation of buyers and sellers, where information about conditions in other markets was exchanged, where the quality of the current harvest in the surrounding region became visible in the prices that sellers could command and buyers were willing to pay. Medieval market regulation was extensive and enforced with variable consistency. The assize of bread, one of the most elaborate pieces of food regulation in the medieval world, governed the price and quality of bread sold in markets across England and later across much of Europe. The assize established a sliding scale that related the price of bread to the current price of wheat. As wheat became more expensive, the price of bread rose proportionally, so that in theory the baker maintained a consistent profit margin regardless of grain prices while consumers paid what the market required. Bakers who sold underweight loaves, who took more profit than the assize permitted by giving less bread for the price, faced specific and often publicly visible punishments. The most vivid of these punishments was the hurdle. A baker convicted of selling underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a flat wooden frame, with the offending loaf tied around their neck, the procession moving through the busiest streets of the town at the hour of maximum public activity, ensuring that the maximum number of people witnessed the punishment and understood what it signified. This was not merely humiliation. It was information. It told everyone who saw it exactly what the standard was, what happened when the standard was violated, and who had violated it. The cookshop was one of the more socially important institutions in larger medieval towns, the medieval equivalent of the ready-made food establishment, selling cooked food to people who needed to eat but lacked the facilities, the time, or the skills to cook for themselves. The cookshop's customers were primarily the urban poor and working class, journeymen and apprentices living in rented rooms without hearths, day laborers who spent their working hours at sites removed from any kitchen, travelers who arrived in town without domestic arrangements. The pie sold by the medieval cookshop was one of the more significant food forms of the period, not a sweet dessert but a savory meat preparation in a thick pastry casing that served as both cooking vessel and container. The pastry of a medieval pie was not intended to be eaten as a delicacy. It was a crust, a dense shell of flour and fat that protected the filling from direct heat and sealed in the juices during cooking. Eating the crust was eating packaging, essentially, and the pastry that surrounded a pie of any quality was dense and chewy rather than flaky and delicious. The filling was the point. Pies had the practical advantage of portability in a way that almost no other cooked food did. A pie could be made, baked, cooled, and carried. It could be eaten without utensils, without a fire, without any of the equipment that a hot cooked meal ordinarily required. The person who bought a small meat pie from a cookshop stall and ate it standing at the market, using their hands, in the few minutes available before returning to work, this was a form of convenient, portable prepared food as conceptually modern as anything sold from a food truck today. The form was different. The function was identical. The medieval market also included the sellers of raw ingredients that households would take home to cook themselves, bundles of fresh herbs in spring and summer, sacks of grain and dried legumes, eggs by the dozen, cheeses of various ages and sizes, butter in wooden containers, honey from beekeepers who understood the market's demand for sweetness in a world where sweetness was still a luxury. The range of produce available varied enormously by region, by season, and by the wealth of the local agricultural economy. The person who shopped at the medieval market, the household manager or the cook of a great establishment or the cellarer of a monastery, was exercising a form of expertise that had no formal title but was entirely real. They knew which cellars were reliable. They knew what quality looked like, smelled like, felt like. They knew when prices were fair and when they were inflated. They knew the seasonal rhythm of what was available when, and they planned their households eating around that rhythm with a practicality that modern shopping, with its year-round global supply of almost everything, has made largely unnecessary. Fish, fasting, and the Church's rules. The medieval Church did not merely provide spiritual guidance. It legislated eating, through its authority over the calendar, over the definition of virtue and sin, over the daily and weekly and seasonal structure of Christian life. The Church imposed a set of dietary rules on the medieval population of Europe that were more comprehensive, more detailed, and more consistently enforced than any modern food regulation. These rules touched the lives of every person in the community, from the Pope to the poorest peasant, and their effects on medieval food culture were profound and lasting. The central mechanism of church food regulation was fasting. Fasting, in the medieval sense, did not mean total abstinence from food, it meant abstinence from the foods classified as meat and its associated products, flesh, blood, fat, eggs, and dairy. On fasting days, Christians were required to eat only fish and plant foods. The theological reasoning was complex and evolved over the centuries, but the practical effect was straightforward. On fasting days, you could not eat meat. The number of fasting days in the medieval calendar was substantial. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was the Great Fast, the period of extended dietary restriction that was the most important and the most carefully observed. Every Friday was a weekly fast, commemorating the crucifixion. Saturdays were fasting days in many regions and periods. The vigils before major feast days were fasting days. The Ember Days, 4 groups of 3 days spread through the year, were fasting days. When all these obligations were totaled, a medieval Christian in good standing might spend more than 150 days per year abstaining from meat. This created an extraordinary market for fish. The demand for fish in a society where more than a third of all days were officially meatless was enormous and drove one of the most significant industries of the medieval economy. The North Sea herring fishery, the Icelandic cod fishery, the salmon rivers of Britain and France and the Rhine, all of these were fished intensively to meet a demand that the church created and the market served. Fresh fish was available near bodies of water, but its range was severely limited by the speed of spoilage in the pre-refrigeration world. Salt fish, preserved herring, preserved cod, was the solution for the inland population that constituted the majority of medieval Europe. The process of salting herring at sea, immediately after catching, made it possible to transport the fish hundreds of miles inland before it became inedible. Salt cod, bacalhau, stockfish, dried and salted, almost as hard as wood, capable of lasting years if kept dry, became one of the most important food commodities in the medieval world, traded from Iceland and Norway to every corner of the European interior. The variety of fish available to medieval consumers was greater than might be expected, at least in well-documented elite contexts. The Fermi of curry and other medieval cookbooks include preparations for pike, bream, carp, tench, trout, salmon, sturgeon, whale, porpoise, and various saltwater fish, prepared with the same range of techniques and the same spice-enhanced sauces as meat dishes. Whale and porpoise were classified as fish for purposes of the fasting rules, a classification that reflected the medieval taxonomic system's organization of the natural world around where creatures lived rather than their biological characteristics, and were therefore available on fast days, prized for their fat flesh. The monastic fish pond, the vivarium, was in large part a response to the fasting rules. A monastery that ate no meat for a third of the year needed a reliable supply of fish, and maintaining its own fish pond gave it control over that supply in a way that dependence on the market could not. The fish pond was a managed ecosystem, stocked with specific species selected for growth rate and eating quality, maintained with attention to water quality and predator control, harvested selectively to preserve breeding populations. It was medieval aquaculture, not labeled as such, but recognizable as the same practice. The social complexity of the fasting rules produced interesting negotiations between religious obligation and practical reality. Wealthy households and ecclesiastical institutions often interpreted the prohibitions in ways that maintained the spirit while adjusting the letter. Barnacle geese, migratory birds that medieval natural philosophy believed to hatch from barnacles growing on driftwood, were classified in some authorities as neither fish nor flesh, and therefore permissible on fast days. The puffin, nesting at the water's edge, was similarly reclassified. These interpretations served the needs of people who wanted the religious credit of fasting without the full dietary privation, and they were endorsed by enough authorities to become conventional. For the poor, the fasting rules imposed a diet that was, in nutritional terms, sometimes better and sometimes worse than what they would have eaten otherwise. A fast-day diet of dried peas, dried beans, salt herring, and vegetables could provide adequate protein and a reasonable range of vitamins, better, in some respects, than the meat-focused diet of feast days, which was often high in saturated fat and low in plant nutrients. But the poorest people, who could not afford even salt herring in adequate quantities, fasted in the most literal sense. They ate less on fast days because less was available, and the church's requirements had removed the option of the salt pork that might otherwise have stretched the pottage further. Fish shaped medieval eating in ways that persist in modern food culture, particularly in Catholic communities. The Friday fish tradition, the habit of eating fish on Fridays, survived the Reformation in some communities and the collapse of compulsory fasting requirements in others, transformed from a religious obligation into a cultural practice, a habit so old that it had become identity. The fish and chip shop in a British high street, the fish fry at the parish on Friday evening, the tradition of eating fish on Good Friday, these are medieval fasting rules that transformed into cultural memory, a ghost of the Church's old authority over the dinner table. Poisoning and the dark side of medieval food. Medieval food killed people, not metaphorically, not indirectly through long-term nutritional deficiency, though that also happened. Sometimes directly, acutely, and without warning, in ways that the people who ate the food could not predict or prevent. We have already encountered ergot, the fungal contaminant of rye that caused St. Anthony's fire, the burning, hallucinatory, gangrenous illness that visited medieval communities in cycles of contaminated grain. But ergot was not the only microbiological danger in the medieval food supply. It was simply the most dramatic, the most documented, the one whose effects were extreme enough to generate the chronicle accounts that allow us to identify it from a distance of centuries. Botulism, the toxin produced by Clostridium botulinum bacteria in anaerobic, low-acid food environments, was almost certainly a cause of medieval deaths, particularly from preserved meats. Sausages and preserved pork, made and stored under conditions that sometimes allowed anaerobic bacterial growth, could accumulate botulinum toxin in quantities sufficient to kill. The name botulism, in fact, derives from the Latin botulus, meaning sausage, a reflection of the historical association between the disease and preserved meat. Medieval people who died after eating sausage, suddenly and mysteriously, were experiencing botulism, though the cause was invisible and the connection between the food and the death might not have been apparent even to observers. Aflatoxins, the carcinogenic compounds produced by Aspergillus fungi growing on stored grain and nuts, were present in the medieval diet in quantities we cannot precisely measure, but that must have been significant given the storage conditions of the period. Grain stored in damp conditions, inadequately sealed against moisture, was vulnerable to Aspergillus colonization. Long-term aflatoxin exposure causes liver damage and significantly elevates the risk of liver cancer. Medieval life expectancy statistics are confounded by the very high rate of childhood mortality, but the adults who survived to middle age often died of conditions that modern analysis would associate with chronic toxic exposures alongside infectious disease. Lead was a pervasive toxic element in the medieval diet, though its presence came from multiple sources and was entirely invisible. Roman plumbing, the lead pipes and lead-lined aqueducts that Roman engineering had installed across the empire, continued to function in some areas through the early medieval period. Wine transported in lead-lined vessels absorbed lead from the container. Pewter, a tin and lead alloy, was widely used for tableware in prosperous medieval households and slowly dissolved trace quantities of lead into acidic foods. Pottery glazed with lead-based compounds leached lead into food and drink stored or cooked in it. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, cognitive impairment, fatigue, abdominal pain, behavioral changes, eventual neurological deterioration, are consistent with conditions documented in medieval medical texts but attributed to other causes. The falling sickness that afflicted a range of historical figures across the medieval period may, in some cases, represent unrecognized lead toxicity. The behavioral peculiarities of some medieval rulers and nobles, the erratic decision-making, the sudden rages, the mental deterioration that chroniclers sometimes attribute to divine punishment or demonic influence, may have had, in some cases, a simpler biochemical explanation. Deliberate poisoning was a genuine feature of medieval life, or at least of medieval anxiety. The frequency with which medieval chronicles and court records mention suspected poisoning, and the frequency with which medieval great households employed food tasters, people whose job was to eat a portion of the Lord's food before the Lord did, gambling their own life against the possibility of assassination, suggests that the danger was real enough to warrant preventive measures. Some of these fears were likely paranoia, the projection of political anxiety onto the mechanism of food. But some were not. The plants of the medieval environment included a range of highly toxic species that were easily confused with edible ones or that entered the food supply through contamination of grain fields. Hemlock, henbane, deadly nightshade, monkshood, these grew in the same hedgerows and field margins as edible plants and could be gathered by someone who did not know the difference. The knowledge of which plants were safe and which were dangerous was part of the practical education that every medieval household manager needed, but that knowledge was not universal, and its absence could be fatal. Mushrooms presented a particular challenge. The edible and the deadly grew in the same woods, at the same season, with a physical resemblance that deceived even experienced foragers. The Amanita phalloides, the death cap, responsible for the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings in Europe today as in the medieval period, is not only easily confused with the edible Amanita caesarea and other edible species, but its toxins produce symptoms that are delayed for 12 to 24 hours, by which point the critical damage to the liver and kidneys is already done and the connection between the mushroom eaten yesterday and the dying body of today is not obvious. The medieval response to food poisoning, to all illness, but particularly to the sudden dramatic illness that might follow a meal, was filtered through the lens of humoral medicine and religious understanding. Illness was caused by imbalance of the humors, or by sinful living, or by malicious magic, or by divine punishment. The idea that invisible organisms growing on food could produce toxins that caused specific patterns of illness was not available. Treatment was accordingly misaligned with cause, purging, bleeding, prayer, pilgrimage. There is something melancholy about this, the gap between the nature of the problem and the available responses to it. People died of things that were preventable by knowledge that did not yet exist. This is not a medieval failure. It is simply the condition of any period before the specific knowledge was available. We are, ourselves, in some future century's equivalent position, dying of things that will seem obviously preventable when the knowledge exists. The medieval food supply was dangerous in ways its users could not see. They managed the dangers they could see and died of the ones they couldn't. The women in the kitchen. The medieval kitchen was, with certain exceptions, run by women. This was not a rule. It was not formally specified in any law or custom as the exclusive province of women. The great kitchens of noble households and monasteries employed male cooks, male bakers, male carvers and servers, all organized in a masculine hierarchy under the master cook who reported to the steward who reported to the lord. The prestigious, well-compensated work of elite cooking was, in the public and documented world of the medieval record, largely masculine. But the cooking that fed most people most of the time, the daily bread and pottage and ale that sustained the 90% of the population who were ordinary people in ordinary households, was done by women. The peasant wife, the village alewife, the farmhouse cook, these women produced the food that the majority of medieval people ate, every day, from childhood to death, using knowledge that they had acquired from the women who preceded them and that they would transmit to the women who followed. This knowledge was vast. It encompassed the entire range of what we would now distribute across multiple professional specializations: nutrition, food safety, food preservation, fermentation, herbal medicine, agricultural planning, and the management of stored food through seasonal change. It was held in no written text. It was not taught in any school. It existed entirely in the practiced hands and the observant minds of women who worked in kitchens from the time they were old enough to stand beside the hearth and watch. The day of a peasant woman in a medieval household was organized around food in a way that modern life is not. It began, often, before dawn, with the rebuilding of the fire from the embers of the previous night. The fire had to be managed carefully. Too much would waste it, a scarce resource; too little and the porridge would not cook before the morning's work began. The porridge had to be made. The children needed to eat before the day's labor started. The husband, if he was working in the fields, needed bread and ale to take with him. The animals needed water. The garden needed attention. And in the margins and background of all of this, the next meal needed to begin, the pottage that would be ready when the day's main meal was eaten in the early afternoon. Bread making, when it happened, added hours to the day. The flour had to be measured from the stored grain, the starter added, the dough kneaded with the particular physical understanding of someone who knew by feel when the dough was right. Kneading bread dough sufficiently, working the gluten strands to the point where the bread would rise and have the appropriate texture, requires sustained physical effort, the kind that develops specific muscle memory over years of practice. It cannot be learned quickly. It is known through repetition. Ale-making was similarly time-intensive and technically complex. Malting grain, allowing it to germinate partially and then drying it, required knowledge of the correct degree of germination, the appropriate drying temperature, the signs that indicated the malt was ready. Mashing, fermenting, monitoring the fermentation, all of these required attention and judgment that was built from experience. An alewife who produced consistently good ale had accumulated, over years of practice, a body of knowledge that we would recognize as applied biochemistry, though she would not have described it in those terms. The herb garden was the medieval woman's pharmacy. The cultivation, harvesting, drying, and preparation of medicinal herbs was understood as an extension of food management, not as a separate domain. The same knowledge that told you which herbs improved the flavor of a pottage also told you which herbs were useful for a fever, which were helpful for a difficult labor, which could ease the cough that settled into the chest after a cold winter. This knowledge was not licensed or formally recognized. It was simply useful, and its possession made a woman an important resource for the community that surrounded her. The cookbooks that survive from the medieval period are almost entirely authored or dictated by men, compiled in professional court and household contexts where male cooks served male employers, and the record-keeping that was necessary to maintain a complex professional operation produced written documents. The food of ordinary women, the food that fed most people, left almost no written trace. We know it existed, and we can reconstruct some of its content from agricultural records, from legal documents about grain prices and food sales, from the occasional detail in a saint's life or a chronicle. But the lived experience of the woman at the hearth, the specific texture of her daily practice, is largely invisible to the historical record. This invisibility is not incidental. It is the same invisibility that affects women's work in most historical periods, the work that happens in private, that produces no surplus for sale, that is too ordinary and too essential to be thought worthy of documentation. The bread and pottage and ale that sustained medieval life were made by women who did not write about what they were doing and whose employers did not think the doing of it was remarkable enough to record. And yet this work was the foundation of everything. Without the daily bread, the pottage, the ale, without the knowledge that produced these things, consistently, in season and out, through years of good harvest and bad, through illness and childbirth and the full range of circumstances that ordinary life encompasses, the medieval world would not have functioned. The chroniclers who recorded the affairs of kings and battles and councils of the church depended, for their ability to write anything at all, on the women in the kitchen who fed them. The invisible work is always the most fundamental work. It was true in the medieval kitchen. It remains true now. Children and what they were fed. Medieval children entered the world in a food environment that would kill a significant proportion of them before they reached adulthood. The mortality rate for children in medieval Europe was staggering by modern standards. Between a third and a half of children born in the medieval period died before reaching the age of 5. Not all of these deaths were directly caused by malnutrition. Infectious disease was the primary killer, and medieval childhood was exposed to infections against which it had no pharmaceutical defense. But malnutrition and infection are not independent causes of death. They work together, malnourished children being far more vulnerable to infectious disease than well-nourished ones, and the food environment of medieval childhood contributed directly to the vulnerability that made so many of those deaths possible. The feeding of medieval infants began with breastfeeding, which was the universal norm in a world where no safe alternative existed. Breast milk provided not only nutrition but also the immunological protection of maternal antibodies, a protection that was particularly important in an environment rich with the microorganisms against which medieval adults had developed some resistance but against which newborns had none. Medieval medical authorities and the practical wisdom of experienced women agreed on the importance of breastfeeding, though they disagreed about its duration and about the role of the wet nurse. The wet nurse, a woman hired to breastfeed the child of another woman, was a significant figure in elite medieval households and in urban settings where mothers worked. The wet nurse's food supply and health directly affected the quality of the milk she provided, which made the hiring of a healthy, well-fed wet nurse both important and expensive. Poor women, whose own nutrition was inadequate, produced milk of lower nutritional quality for their own infants and were less desirable as wet nurses for the wealthy, a compounding disadvantage that began at birth. Weaning, the transition from breast milk to solid food, typically began in medieval practice somewhere between 6 months and a year, and was accomplished by introducing soft foods, pottage thinned with milk, bread softened in water or broth, frumenty. The transition was nutritionally precarious. Breast milk is nutritionally complete for an infant in a way that the medieval weaning diet was not, and children who were weaned early, or who were weaned onto inadequate solid food, were at significant risk of the protein-energy malnutrition that medieval physicians described without understanding its cause. The signs of severe childhood malnutrition, the swollen belly, the stick limbs, the failure to thrive, the susceptibility to every illness that passed through the community, appear in medieval medical texts and chronicles as recognized conditions, even if the etiology was wrongly understood. A child who grew slowly, who had frequent infections, who failed to develop the energy and physical development appropriate to their age, was not diagnosed as malnourished in the modern sense. They were understood as constitutionally weak, or as subject to some spiritual or supernatural influence, or as suffering from an imbalance of the humors that required correction through treatment. Children's food was not categorically different from adult food in most medieval households. The same pottage, the same bread, the same ale in smaller quantities, this was what children ate, from the time they were weaned until they were adults, because it was what the household produced and there were no special foods reserved for children. In affluent households, young children might receive foods considered particularly appropriate to their constitution according to humoral theory, mild, moist foods that matched the supposed cool, wet humoral state of childhood. Milk, soft bread, gentle pottages of mild vegetables, as children grew and took on work, and medieval children took on agricultural labor by the age of 7 or 8, the age of reason in the Church's framework, when they were considered capable of understanding and responsible for their actions, their caloric needs increased substantially. Growing children doing physical labor in the fields needed more food than they typically received. The chronic mild hunger that was the baseline condition of many medieval peasant households fell more heavily on growing children, whose needs were less negotiable than those of adults whose labor the household depended on. Feast days and religious celebrations offered children temporary relief from the dietary monotony of daily life. The meat of a Christmas feast, the eggs of Easter, the special breads baked for specific saints' days, these punctuated the year with food experiences that were different and better, and which the memory of childhood preserved as significant. The medieval child's food memories were organized around scarcity and exception in a way that the modern child's are not. The special food was remembered because it was rare, and it was rare because it was special, and the rarity made it more meaningful. There is something in this, in the child's memory of good food in the context of ordinary deprivation, that modern sensibility finds difficult to fully grasp. We are not accustomed to understanding plenty as exception and scarcity as background. For the medieval child, it was simply the texture of life. The pottage every day and the feast day roast once a year were not experienced as injustice, they were experienced as the world, which was what it was and was not otherwise imaginable. The feast was good because it was food and you were hungry and it tasted like something that was not ordinary. That is enough for a child to remember with pleasure through a long life. Sugar, the medicine that became a luxury. In the medieval medical pharmacy, sugar was a drug, not a pleasure. Not an indulgence. A medicine, a specific therapeutic substance prescribed by physicians for specific conditions, dosed carefully and administered in preparations that combined it with other medicinal ingredients. A patient prescribed a sugar-based electuary or confection was receiving treatment, in the framework of medieval medicine, as genuinely as the patient receiving a prescription today. This framing, sugar as medicine, was the product of the same Arab medical tradition that preserved and transmitted Greek medical learning through the early medieval period. Arab physicians of the 9th and 10th centuries had access to cane sugar from the plantations of Persia and Egypt, had used it in their medical preparations, and had written extensively about its medicinal properties in the humoral framework. When this scholarship was translated into Latin and began circulating in European medical schools and monasteries from the 11th century onward, sugar came with it, as a substance with understood medical properties, available in the apothecary's shop, expensive and carefully used. The properties attributed to sugar in humoral medicine were, in the framework of the system, entirely plausible. Sugar was classified as warm and moist, qualities that made it appropriate for a range of conditions associated with cold and dry imbalances. It was considered to have preservative properties, a digestive action, and a quality of refining or purifying other medicines with which it was combined. These attributions were not supported by the empirical science that we now require for medical claims, but they were internally consistent with the medical theory of the period and were taken seriously by educated practitioners. The availability of sugar in medieval Europe was severely limited by its supply chain. Sugar cane grew in tropical and subtropical climates, Persia, Egypt, Sicily, later the Iberian coast of North Africa. It required enormous labor to cultivate and process, harvesting the cane, crushing it to extract the juice, boiling and clarifying and crystallizing the sugar in a process that demanded fuel, expertise, and continuous physical labor. The resulting product, refined crystalline sugar, was transported at considerable expense through the Mediterranean trade networks that Italian merchants controlled, arriving in northern European markets as a luxury commodity priced far beyond the reach of ordinary people. Medieval recipes that called for sugar, and there are many, in the cookbooks that survive from affluent households and monasteries, used it in quantities that reflected its luxury status. A dish that called for a few ounces of sugar represented a significant expenditure, one that would be noted in household accounts and understood as a marker of the meal's special character. Sugar in a dish was a statement, not unlike the statement made by the expensive spices in the same dish, about the resources of the household that served it. The combination of sugar with spices in medieval elite cooking produced a flavor profile that is genuinely alien to modern palates conditioned on the salt-dominant cuisine that became standard in later periods. Medieval dishes that appear, from their main ingredients, to be savory, roasted meats, fish preparations, vegetable pottages, were frequently sweetened with sugar or honey, spiced with cinnamon and ginger, finished with dried fruits. The boundary between sweet and savory that modern Western cooking enforces so firmly did not exist in the same way in the medieval kitchen. A sauce for roasted venison might contain as much sugar as the dessert that followed it. The dental consequences of this sugar consumption were visible in the skeletal remains of medieval people who could afford sugar. Medieval dentistry was primitive, painful, and limited essentially to extraction. There were no fillings, no crowns, no root canals. The tooth decay caused by sugar consumption was treated, when it became unbearable, by pulling the tooth. Medieval people who ate sweetened foods regularly, primarily the wealthy, show significantly higher rates of dental decay and tooth loss in archaeological analysis than those who did not. The association between wealth and rotten teeth in the medieval world was real and observable. It was the opposite of the modern association between wealth and dental health. The transformation of sugar from medicine to luxury began in the 13th and 14th centuries and was complete, in the markets of elite consumption, by the 15th. The expansion of sugar production, initially in the eastern Mediterranean, then increasingly in Atlantic islands like Madeira and the Canaries as Portuguese explorers and merchants developed new supply routes, gradually increased supply and reduced price. As price fell, the medical framing became less necessary to justify consumption, and the pleasure framing, eating sugar because it was pleasurable, became more available. By the late medieval period, sugar was still expensive but no longer exclusively medicinal. Confectionery, the art of making sugary sweets, marzipan, sugar sculptures, the subtleties of the great feast, had developed as a distinct culinary tradition in elite households. The skills of the confectioner were recognized as a genuine craft, distinct from cooking, requiring specific knowledge of how sugar behaved at different temperatures and concentrations, knowledge that was, again, entirely practical and experiential, not based on understanding the chemistry involved, but accurate enough to produce the results the craft required. The story of sugar in the medieval world is the beginning of a story that continues through the development of the Atlantic slave trade, which was, in its origins, a labor system created to supply the sugar cane plantations that the medieval appetite for sweetness had established, through the industrialization of sugar production that made it cheap enough for mass consumption, through the current moment in which the medical consequences of that mass consumption are among the primary public health concerns of the developed world. The medieval physician who prescribed sugar as medicine initiated, without any way of knowing it, a chain of events that has not yet concluded. Cheese, butter, and the dairy mysteries. There is something almost miraculous about dairy production, viewed through the lens of medieval knowledge. Milk, a liquid that spoils within hours in warm weather, that sours, thickens, separates, becomes something else almost before you can drink it, can, through specific processes of acidification and concentration, be transformed into cheese that lasts for years. It can be agitated until its fat separates into butter that, properly salted, keeps for months. It can be allowed to curdle gently into a soft fresh cheese that is ready to eat the same day it is made. These transformations were understood in the medieval world as practical knowledge, not as mystery, but that does not make them less extraordinary. The medieval dairy woman who made cheese had no understanding of the bacteria and molds whose activity was responsible for every stage of the process. She understood the process through its sensory signals, the smell of the maturing cheese, its color, its texture, its response to touch, signals accumulated through years of practice that told her, accurately, whether the cheese was progressing as it should or whether something had gone wrong. The dairy was a central element of the medieval agricultural operation, and its management was, in most regions, the work of women. The milking of cows and ewes and goats, done twice daily, by hand, a physical task requiring specific technique and a relationship of familiarity with each animal, was women's work. The processing of the milk, the making of butter and cheese, the management of the dairy's tools and spaces, these were skills transmitted within female communities, learned in childhood and practiced through adulthood. Butter was made by agitating cream, either in a churn, a vessel specifically designed for the purpose, or in a skin bag that could be swung and beaten. The agitation caused the fat globules in the cream to clump together and separate from the remaining liquid, buttermilk. The resulting butter was washed with water to remove residual buttermilk, which would cause it to sour more quickly, and then salted. Salt preserved the butter and flavored it. Heavily salted butter kept much longer than lightly salted or unsalted, and butter intended for long-term storage was packed into crocks with enough salt to preserve it through winter. Cheese production began with the curdling of milk, the separation of the solid protein and fat components from the liquid whey. The agent that caused this separation was rennet, an enzyme found in the stomach of young ruminants that had been used for cheese-making since the earliest periods of livestock domestication. A small piece of dried rennet added to warm milk caused it to coagulate within an hour or two into a soft curd. This curd could be eaten fresh, soft cheese, cottage cheese, the simple fresh cheeses of every dairy tradition, or it could be pressed, drained, salted, and aged into the range of harder cheeses that the medieval dairy produced. The range of cheeses produced in medieval Europe was considerable, though the documentation of specific varieties before the later medieval period is patchy. Certain regions were already associated with particular cheeses in the high medieval period: Brie and Camembert in France, various English hard cheeses, the sheep's milk cheeses of the Mediterranean regions. The characteristics that distinguish these regional cheeses, the specific bacteria and molds present in the local environment, the particular qualities of the milk produced by locally adapted animals, the traditional practices of the regional dairy, were not understood in the modern sense, but they were real and they produced real variety. The whey left from cheese-making was not wasted. It was fed to pigs, which thrived on it and converted it efficiently into the salt pork that was the peasant's primary preserved protein. The byproduct of one food production process became the feed for the animal that produced another. The medieval farm was a circular system in which very little was wasted, because very little could be afforded to be wasted. Dairy consumption in the medieval period was shaped by the Church's fasting rules in ways that profoundly affected the dairy industry. Eggs and dairy, milk, butter, cheese, were classified differently by different authorities and in different periods, sometimes allowed on fast days and sometimes prohibited. The question of whether dairy was acceptable during Lent was debated extensively by medieval theologians, with practical consequences for the production and demand of dairy products. In regions where dairy was permitted during fasting periods, the demand for cheese as a protein source on meatless days drove production. In regions where dairy was prohibited, the demand collapsed and the dairy industry adjusted accordingly. Cheese, in the medieval social imagination, occupied an ambiguous position. It was sometimes dismissed as the food of peasants and the poor, easy to make, long-lasting, requiring no cooking, eaten without ceremony. And indeed, cheese and bread was the simplest and most common meal of ordinary medieval life, eaten in the field by agricultural workers, eaten by travelers, eaten by anyone who needed something that could be carried and consumed without fire or equipment. But certain cheeses, aged, expensive, associated with specific places and specific production traditions, were valued differently, served at elite tables, traded at market as luxury goods. The medieval dairy was a place of daily transformation, milk into butter, milk into cheese, the perishable into the durable, the immediate into the preserved. This transformation was performed every day, by women who knew exactly what they were doing without knowing why it worked, in service of feeding communities that depended on their knowledge for a significant portion of their nutrition. The dairy mysteries were no mystery at all to the people who practiced them. They were simply craft, the daily, unglamorous, essential craft of keeping people fed. Food and the body, what medieval people believed. Before we can fully understand what medieval people ate, we need to understand what they believed food did to their bodies. Because the medieval understanding of the relationship between food and health was not merely different from the modern understanding, it was organized around entirely different principles, constructed from different assumptions, and it shaped food choices in ways that only make sense within the framework that produced them. The foundational framework was humoral theory. Developed in ancient Greece, systematized by Galen in the 2nd century, preserved and elaborated by Arab physicians, and transmitted to medieval Europe through the translations that began in the 11th century, humoral theory held that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance caused disease. Each humor was associated with specific qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and with specific seasons, elements, temperaments, and organs. Food was understood as a primary agent in managing the humoral balance. Eating a food classified as hot and wet would increase the hot and wet qualities in the body, correcting a cold and dry imbalance but potentially creating a hot and wet excess. Eating a cold and dry food would have the opposite effect. The physician's art lay in understanding the patient's current humoral state, which was assessed through symptoms, through the appearance of the urine, through the character of the pulse, and prescribing a diet and treatment that would move the humors back toward balance. The classification of foods within this system was elaborate and internally consistent. Raw vegetables were generally classified as cold and moist, potentially problematic for people with cold constitutions, particularly dangerous for the elderly and the sick whose bodily heat was understood to be diminishing. Cooked vegetables were warmer than raw. Cooking was understood to add heat to the food. Meat was hot and moist, with the specific quality varying by the animal and the cut. Fish was cold and moist, appropriate for certain conditions, problematic for others. Spices were almost universally hot and dry, corrective of cold and moist imbalances, dangerous if taken in excess by people who were already hot and dry. The implications for cooking practice were direct and pervasive. Physicians advised patients to cook their vegetables rather than eat them raw, not because of food safety concerns but because the cooking warmed the food and made it more appropriate for the constitution. Salad greens, cold and moist, should be dressed with vinegar, which is hot and dry, to correct the imbalance. Fruit, generally cold and moist, was advised to be eaten at the beginning of the meal, before the heavier foods, to prepare the stomach for digestion. Eating fruit after the meal was considered potentially harmful because the fruit would slow the digestion of what preceded it. Digestion itself was understood through the humoral framework as a process of cooking. The body's heat cooked the food in the stomach, reducing it to the forms that could be absorbed and distributed through the body's systems. Food that was already well cooked was easier for the body's digestive heat to process. Raw, cold, dense food placed a greater burden on the digestive heat. This is why medieval medicine was suspicious of uncooked food and why the recommendation to cook vegetables thoroughly, to warm and soften meat, to prepare food in forms that reduced the digestive labor required, was medically sound advice in the framework of humoral theory. even if it had no relationship to the microbiology that modern food safety is based on. The concept of corrupted or bad air, miasma, interacted with the humoral framework to produce an additional set of dietary concerns. Miasma theory held that disease was caused by corrupt air arising from rotting organic matter, and that the body could be protected by consuming foods that resisted corruption or that strengthened the body against the corrupting influence. Spices, with their strong smells and their qualities of heat and dryness, were believed to counteract miasma, which is why wealthy people carried pomanders, balls of perfumed spices, during epidemics, and why physicians advised the consumption of spiced foods during periods of plague. The logic was internally consistent, it simply pointed to the wrong mechanism. The regimen of health, the set of dietary and lifestyle recommendations that constituted medieval preventive medicine, was a genre of text produced by medieval physicians and directed at the literate class who could afford both the text and the foods it recommended. These texts advised which foods to eat in which seasons, what to eat before and after physical activity, what to avoid during illness, how to combine foods for optimal humoral balance. They were, in their way, the medieval equivalent of the nutrition advice column, authoritative, prescriptive, and often contradictory depending on which authority you consulted. The regimen of health literature makes clear that the relationship between food and the body was not treated casually by those who thought about it carefully. It was a subject of serious intellectual engagement, connected to the broader philosophical frameworks of the period, debated in universities, refined through practical experience. The conclusions reached were wrong, in the specific factual sense that modern nutritional science can assess them. But the project, taking seriously the question of how what you eat affects your body, was right, and the seriousness with which medieval physicians pursued it produced a body of observational knowledge about food and health that was not entirely without value, even when the theoretical framework was mistaken. The last great medieval feast. In 1483, Richard III of England was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. The coronation feast that followed was, in the medieval tradition of such occasions, an expression of royal power through the medium of food, a demonstration of resources, organizational capacity, and the particular theatrical genius that great feasts required when performed at their highest level. It was also, though no one present could have known this, one of the last great expressions of a food culture that was about to begin changing beyond recognition. The feast of Richard III's coronation is documented in the household accounts that survive, the lists of provisions purchased, the quantities of each item, the payments made to suppliers and kitchen staff and servers and musicians. Reading these accounts is an experience of scale that is difficult to fully absorb. Hundreds of oxen, sheep, and calves. Thousands of capons and other birds. Hundreds of barrels of ale and wine. Sugar, spices, and dried fruits in quantities measured in pounds and hundredweights. The provisions for a single feast of the highest order required the mobilization of supply chains stretching across England and beyond, the coordination of hundreds of workers across the days before the event. The kitchen staff who prepared this feast worked in conditions that we would find extraordinary. The royal kitchen was a large-scale operation, multiple hearths, multiple cooks each responsible for specific preparations, a hierarchy of authority that moved from the master cook through various levels of specialized workers to the scullions who kept the kitchen clean and the water bearers who maintained the supply of water that every cooking operation required. The work began days before the feast and continued through the night before it. The feast itself unfolded in the medieval pattern of multiple courses, each presented with ceremony. The Great Hall of Westminster Palace was arranged with tables for the hundreds of guests who attended the coronation feast, each person seated according to their rank, the seating itself a statement about hierarchy. The highest nobility sat nearest the king's table. Lesser nobility and important clergy occupied the middle tables. Household officers and minor officials sat at the lower tables. The social order of medieval England was physically mapped onto the room, and the food that each table received reflected the social position of those at it. The menu would have included the roasted meats, venison and other game, beef and mutton, the whole array of birds, that defined elite feast cooking. The subtleties, the sugar sculptures and pastry creations that were brought in between courses to be admired before being consumed or distributed, displayed the confectioner's art. The spiced wines, the preserved fruits, the elaborate pastry creations filled with exotic combinations of ingredients, the presentation that treated each course as a theatrical event requiring its own procession and its own protocol of service. The wine served at such a feast came from France and the Rhine and the Mediterranean, the product of the same international trade that brought spices and sugar to England. In the year 1483, wine was still expensive enough that its consumption at a feast was a marker of status, still close enough to the status of genuine luxury that serving large quantities of it was a statement about wealth. Within a century, the expansion of trade and the development of more efficient production and distribution would begin to change this. The guests who ate at Richard III's coronation feast ate with their hands and with personal knives. The fork was not yet in common use at the English table, and would not be for another century. They shared plates and cups with their neighbors, as the tradition of the feast prescribed. They ate in a room filled with music and, later, with performance. The minstrels, the acrobats, the jesters who were part of the entertainment provision of a great medieval feast. Eating and entertainment were not separate experiences, they were simultaneous, the feast a total sensory event. Richard III did not remain king for long. 2 years after his coronation, he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field and the Tudor dynasty began. The change of dynasty was, in historical terms, the beginning of a new period, the transition from what we call medieval to what we call early modern, a transition that would bring new foods, new trade routes, new ideas about health and diet, new technologies of food production and preservation, and eventually the entire revolution in food culture that created the modern world. The coronation feast of 1483 was not the last medieval feast. There was no such clean ending, no moment at which the medieval world put down its trencher and picked up a fork. But it was among the last great celebrations of a food culture organized around the principles that had governed elite medieval eating for centuries: the absolute centrality of roasted meat, the theatrical deployment of rare spices, the hierarchy of access that made the great feast a statement about power as much as a provision of food. The world that produced that feast was already changing when it was celebrated. The Portuguese were establishing trade routes that would eventually break the Italian monopoly on Eastern spices. The printing press was creating new channels for the spread of knowledge, including knowledge about food. The agricultural techniques and plant varieties that would eventually transform the productivity of European farming were beginning their slow spread. The feast of 1483 was, among other things, the feast of a world about to become something else entirely. What was lost and what survived? What do we have left, from 10 centuries of medieval eating? More than you might expect. Less than we might wish for. The ingredients that defined medieval cooking are, most of them, still available. The grain, the legumes, the root vegetables, the salt pork, the fresh and salt fish, these are still grown and harvested and sold. The herbs of the medieval kitchen garden grow in modern gardens and on modern window sills. The spices that were luxury items worth more than silver are now available for a few dollars in any supermarket. The fundamental raw materials of medieval cooking are present, in most cases more accessible than they have ever been at any point in human history. What is not available, what cannot be bought or grown or recovered, is the knowledge and the relationship with food that medieval cooking represented. Not the knowledge of techniques, which can be reconstructed from manuscripts and archaeological evidence and the practical experimentation of food historians. But the relationship, the daily, bodily, seasonal connection to the specific food of a specific place, the knowledge of where exactly this grain was grown and how it grew and what the harvest was like this year and why the bread might taste slightly different from last year's because of the dry summer. The medieval peasant who ate bread made from grain grown in the field visible from the kitchen door had a relationship with that bread that is structurally impossible in a world of global supply chains and industrial agriculture. They knew the field. They had worked it. They had watched the grain grow through the spring and summer, worried about the rain and the sun, harvested it with their own hands, carried it to the mill, brought back the flour. The bread they ate was not a commodity. It was the product of their specific labor in their specific place, and the eating of it was inseparable from the knowing of it. This relationship is not sentimentalized here. The peasant who knew their bread that intimately also knew the fear that the grain might fail, the anxiety that the storage might not last the winter, the specific, bodily vulnerability of people who depend entirely on their own production for their own survival. The knowledge and the fear were inseparable. You cannot have the connection without the risk. What did survive, into the modern world, in recognizable form? The traditions of fermentation, bread made with sourdough starters that are the direct descendants of medieval starter cultures, cheeses made according to regional traditions that have their roots in medieval practice, alesh and wines fermented according to processes that would be recognizable to a medieval brewer. Some of these traditions have survived with extraordinary continuity, certain English cheeses, certain French wines, certain German baked goods, maintained by communities that valued the continuity as a form of identity and cultural memory. The feast culture of medieval Europe transformed, over the succeeding centuries, into the formal dinner party and the restaurant and eventually the food media culture of the present, the elaborate meal as a social occasion, the deployment of food as display, the assumption that eating well was a marker of cultural sophistication. The specific foods changed utterly, the social function of the meal as performance persisted. The monastic tradition of food cultivation and production, the kitchen garden, the fish pond, the brewery, the bakery, survived in attenuated form through the post-Reformation dissolution of many monasteries, but persisted in the communities that maintained religious life and in the secular institutions that inherited some of the monastic functions. The tradition of the kitchen garden, now associated with the English country house and the French potager, has its roots in the monastic garden that fed the medieval community, the medical relationship with food, the idea that what you eat is connected to your health in specific and manageable ways. Survived the collapse of humoral theory and found new expression in the nutritional science that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. The specific claims changed entirely, the assumption that diet was a primary determinant of health, and that the intelligent person should think carefully about what they eat for reasons that go beyond immediate pleasure, is a continuous thread from the medieval regimen of health literature to the contemporary nutrition industry. The plants that the medieval world ate, the specific varieties of wheat, peas, beans, turnips, apples, pears, are mostly gone. Agricultural breeding over the centuries has replaced them with varieties selected for yield, appearance, and transportability rather than for the flavor and regional adaptation that defined medieval varieties. The wild and semi-wild plants that supplemented the medieval diet, the herbs, the berries, the fungi, the freshwater plants, are still present in many ecosystems but are no longer commonly consumed. The narrowing of the human diet, which began to accelerate in the industrial period, has left us eating fewer distinct species than our medieval ancestors, despite having access to more food from more places than at any previous time. What the medieval world ate is past. The conditions that produced it, the scarcity, the seasonality, the local dependence, the physical relationship with the production of food, cannot be recovered except as voluntary practice, as a choice made by people who have the luxury of choosing something difficult when the easy option is available. The relationship between the medieval world and its food was not chosen. It was given, by the conditions of the world, and it shaped those who lived within it in ways both terrible and quietly beautiful. The quiet kitchen at the end of the day, the fire is low, the day's work is done. The fields are still. Whatever was planted this spring will be what it will be, the rain will come or it will not come, the sun will warm the grain or will not, the harvest will be what the season permits. That is not something to think about tonight. Tonight, the pot has been emptied. The bread has been eaten, or most of it, a piece set aside for morning. The ale jug is nearly done. The children are sleeping in the corner on the straw mattress. The animals have been settled for the night. The fire has been banked, its embers arranged to keep through until morning, when the day will begin again with the same tasks in the same order, the same questions of enough and not enough, the same management of what there is. This was dinner, this was what most people ate, for most of 1,000 years, in most of Europe, the pottage in the pot. The bread beside it. The jug of ale. The fire that cooked it and warmed the room and kept the dark at bay. We have been sitting in that kitchen tonight, you and I, and we have looked at everything in it, the bread that was not white and was not soft and was sometimes dangerous and was always the center of daily life, the pottage that was everything and nothing, that varied with the season and the harvest and the contents of the kitchen garden, that simmered in the same pot for years. The ale that was safer than water and tasted like grain and kept the community alive in ways that no one understood. The spices that were worth more than silver and came from places most people had never imagined, the monastery that preserved what the village could not, the famine that reminded everyone that nothing was guaranteed, the great feast that showed how the other half ate, in another world entirely. We have looked at the women who made all of it, whose knowledge and labor fed the medieval world without recognition or record. We have looked at the children who grew up in it, who ate what was given and remembered the feast days as bright moments in ordinary time. We have looked at the darkness, the poison, the contamination, the invisible dangers that killed without announcement. We have looked at the church that shaped what people were allowed to eat and when. We have looked at the dairy and the market and the preserved food that made winter possible. What I want to leave you with, in this quiet at the end of the evening, is not a sense of how much worse the past was than the present, though it was, in many ways that matter, genuinely worse. What I want to leave you with is something about the relationship between people and food that the medieval world had, in the involuntary, difficult, intimate way of people who could not take their food for granted. They knew their food. They knew it the way you know something you depend on entirely, not abstractly, not through labeling and certification and the reassurance of industrial quality control, but bodily, directly, with the specific knowledge that comes from touching and smelling and tasting and worrying and being grateful. The bread that came from grain they had grown in soil they had amended with their own labor, milled at the mill they paid in kind to use, made with their hands in the early morning dark, baked in the communal oven that everyone in the village used, this bread was known in a way that our bread is not. I am not saying they were better for this knowledge. I am not saying the deprivation was ennobling or that the danger was character building. I am saying that the relationship was real in a way that our relationship with food, for all its advantages, sometimes is not. We eat, often, without knowing. We consume without understanding. We are nourished by systems too complex and too distant for individual comprehension. This is, in most ways, an improvement. It is also, in some way that is difficult to name, a loss. The medieval world looked at its food and saw itself, its labor, its season, its land, its community, its place in a universe that was not indifferent to whether the grain grew or not. The food was embedded in everything else that mattered. It could not be separated from the rest of life, because it was the rest of life, because it was what made the rest of life possible. The fire is very low now, the kitchen is dark, outside, the medieval night is the same night that surrounds all of us, the same sky, the same stars, the same darkness before dawn. In the morning, someone will rebuild the fire, and the day will begin again. Sleep now, the kitchen is quiet, the pot is empty, the bread is done, there is enough, there is enough. Good night, this has been Calm and History, a new story waits for you next Thursday. Good night.